technology adoption is one of the topics that's very important for me. When you're evaluating deals, how do you view adoption? Because usually when a company's early stage, right, they're going to be at as far left as you can be on the adoption curve. They're dealing with like technology enthusiasts, not even early adopters yet. And so obviously when you talk to a technology enthusiast, let's say in a case of a surgeon, right, they're going to be everything's great. This thing is amazing. It's so vision, everything. And so it's easy to get caught up in that excitement and hype. How do you go about figuring out, does this technology have legs for true adoption? One thing that I feel like is a good heuristic these days is that because of social media like LinkedIn and Twitter, physicians are starting to post, especially early in new technologies, like their usage of a new tech, their experiences with it. But outside of that, I mean, how do you go about, because again, it's kind of like it's very biased, right? It's kind of like when I interview people and they give me references, nobody in that reference is going to be like, yeah, they're actually not that good. Like nobody's going to say that. It's the same thing with companies like, oh, we'll let you talk to one of our top users. Everything's going to be great. How do you get around that?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to just assume that adoption, and you're absolutely right to raise this point. The adoption rate is probably the single most difficult variable in the entire value equation of a technology to nail. We can probably figure out what the clinical success will be if it's a clinical study. If the clinical success is going to be a little bit lower, we can power the study a little bit larger and overcome that. There are a lot of ways to deal with everything in the pre-commercial world to get a product to that launching pad. Adoption not only is hard to judge, but I would also say it's become intensely more challenging based on everything we know about today, which are in the form of adoption barriers, whether it's value analysis committees at hospitals or contracting norms, you name it. There are many business processes that are either intentionally or unintentionally constructed for the purpose of slowing down technology adoption. And it is because there is a presumption that new technologies drive costs up. So while we're battling that process, that mindset, what's really important is to do really a map of adoption barriers and to understand that by no means is it sufficient to have a surgeon sitting in front of you at the hospital with a cup of coffee after he's done his last procedure and you've just shown him your technology and have him fawning all over it and saying, this is fantastic. If I had that tomorrow, I would use it. Okay, take that and ascribe it to be 0.5% valuable in the larger algorithm of how we're going to map and project adoption. Then you look at all of the other factors that have to be overcome, whether it's a capital equipment purchase, as you describe robotics, if you think about training and learning curve, if you think about contracted barriers in the form of strategics that are there before you and you're a new company. There are so many things that get in the way that you really have to build a balanced equation, both of the probability of overcoming the barrier and the time sink associated with each. And then at the very end is your pot of gold in the form of adoption and first, utilization. But that could be 18 months after that surgeon first tells you that they're in love with your product.
Right, right. One of the things that in my opinion, how much money you take is as important as who you take the money from. And there's a lot of, and again, this is just my personal opinion. There's some medtech VCs where, in my opinion, and I call them medtech VCs, it's a very loose term for them. Just some investors that there's people with a checkbook. That's my opinion. And on the other side of that, there are people like you that, aside from providing that investment, a CEO founder can go to Apollo Violette and get some very solid guidance on, operations, marketing, sales, these kind of things. how do you look at structuring a board, like for a founder? Because sometimes, again, my personal thought on this is that sometimes I see founders where they immediately fill up a board with the wrong people, or let's say they, in the case of a tech enthusiast, it's great to have that first adopter. That's not usually the person you should give an advisory seat to or something, because they might be great that first year, but then 3, 4, 5 years down the line, you're stuck with this person, right? How do you
Yeah.
view that, right? And it's kind
Well,
of a complex question, but it's something that I always think of when I look at startups.
your last point is a really good one. That there are multiple layers of advisory capacity that a CEO can build around his or her company, and you see them often, whether it's scientific advisory boards, clinical and business advisors, and those can all be effective and completely unrelated to the board of directors. So recognize the board for what it is, and use it for that, and don't conflate the role of other advisory capacities, which are potentially equally important, but simply not the same. Number one. Number two, entrepreneurs do need to raise capital, and their number one concern is to assure that their company is properly capitalized. And so sometimes you get to select both the investor and the check. Sometimes you have to take the check and don't get to really select the investor. And there's no binary outcome there. It's graduated. You may get the best of all worlds, you may get the worst of all worlds, but there's there are a lot of ways to sort, I guess. Of course, every venture group, every investment team has a portfolio, has a reputation. You can do a lot of homework. I think the way, if I were to advise a CEO, it's to do as much diligence on your prospective investors as they're doing on you. When it comes to sorting through the ones that you ultimately prioritize, and as a founder, as an entrepreneur, I may have two term sheets on the table, and one may be for the better valuation and more capital and 17 tranches available for the next 12 years. But I may actually be better off taking capital from another group that offers me a better overall blend of value drivers. And so the founder and entrepreneur is in an interesting position at that point. Once you're up and running, if you're a board, you've got fiduciary responsibilities, it's very difficult to not take the deal that looks best on the table. And it's very difficult to take one that is worse quantitatively for difficult to measure qualitative reasons. However, the one time and the one person who can actually make that judgment on his or her own accord is the founder entrepreneur raising capital early on, when they still own a controlling interest in the company, and they're making a decision really for themselves. And if they dilute themselves more and take more costly capital, but from the right investor, that's the right choice to make. So I would look at it and just say, don't chase the best deal, chase the best outcome, and just weigh all those factors and do it more earlier on, where it's easier to actually make those trade-offs, and it's harder to do that later when you have 1, 2 rounds of investors at the table, and now you can't just say, you know what, I want to go with that one, even though their capital is more costly, because now you're not only diluting yourself a little bit more, but you're asking other investors to dilute themselves, and they're less likely to do that. So it's a really important point. You build the board by way of building investors, and you only have so much influence in selecting investors. Later stage companies, if they're on a great roll, they have a great value proposition, they have multiple investors chasing them, great. That's a really good problem to have. You can select. But that doesn't happen in the majority of cases. In the majority of cases, you work hard, you finance aggressively, you get 1 or 2 term sheets, maybe only one is acceptable. So you have to realize the time to really shape things is earlier on, because once you get a late stage term sheet and your company's off and running, you may not have that many choices, and it's too late to then think about, how do I construct things?
Interesting. And so it sounds like your advice is just essentially that earlier on is going to be the most important decision because later on things are kind of in motion. They have momentum. They're a little bit more difficult to change and everything. And so it's almost like starting a company or I guess even a family, which is sort of the culture and tone you set early on is going to really dictate everything else moving forward. Would you agree with that?
Yes. And now listen, if you're lucky and you work hard and you execute well and the early choices you make are favorable, then you do the right things. And then by the time you get to Series B or Series C, it may well be that you're doing so well, you continue to have favorable choices. But you won't, but you can't guarantee that. The only time you can guarantee that you'll have real trade-off flexibility is earlier on.